Hi there! Tonight we pull back the heavy velvet curtains on an era that, for all its proper veneers, had a surprisingly intimate and pervasive relationship with something many of us today prefer to keep at arm's length. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit Victorian parlour, the air thick with the scent of lilies and perhaps a hint of disinfectant. The conversation is hushed, respectful, and almost certainly revolves around a recent passing, a lingering illness, or the proper mourning, attire for a distant cousin. You might be wearing black, or at least a subdued shade of grey, for weeks if not months. It seems as if every other day someone you know or someone connected to someone you know is either on their deathbed or has just departed this mortal coil. You see, for Victorians, death wasn't a distant, abstract concept. It was a constant, undeniable presence, shaping their daily lives, their homes, their fashion, and even their leisure. You probably wouldn't survive a single winter in a Victorian slum without encountering death multiple times, let alone a lifetime. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And do feel free to post where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself, a person living in the Victorian era, facing a reality that is almost unimaginable to us today: high mortality rates. Death was not an abstract concept relegated to hospitals and nursing homes. It was a ubiquitous presence, a constant companion that walked through every street, every household, and touched every family. Infants, children, and adults alike succumb to illnesses that are now easily treatable. A common cold could turn into pneumonia, a scratch could lead to a fatal infection, and childbirth was a perilous journey for both mother and child. Imagine the stark reality of your childhood. Perhaps you would have seen siblings succumb to scarlet, fever, diphtheria, or tuberculosis, often referred to as consumption, a slow, wasting illness that claimed countless lives. It was not uncommon for a family to lose several children before they reached adulthood. Even if you survived childhood, the threat of epidemics like cholera, typhoid, or influenza loomed large. A healthy young adult could be struck down in a matter of days. This mainstream historical fact, the shockingly high mortality rates across all age groups, meant that death was an intimate, recurring experience for almost everyone. Historians still argue whether the intense public displays of mourning were a direct consequence of these high death rates, or if they were also influenced by deeper cultural shifts in how grief was expressed. It's a complex interplay, isn't it? Because while personal loss was undoubtedly profound, the social performance of grief also took on immense significance. You might attend funerals frequently, see black crepe draped over doorways, and witness families enter prolonged periods of mourning. Here's a quirky tidbit. The average life expectancy in certain industrial cities, like Manchester, during the mid-19th century was often as low as 25-30 years, drastically lower than rural areas or for the upper classes. Imagine living with that statistical reality, knowing that old age was a privilege, not a guarantee. The quiet dread, the constant awareness of fragility, meant that death was never far from your thoughts. This pervasive presence of death, witnessed first-hand and frequently, fundamentally shaped the Victorian psyche, making it not just an event, but a central preoccupation of life itself. In the face of such pervasive mortality, the Victorians often sought solace and meaning in something deeply ingrained in their society: religious beliefs and the afterlife. Imagine yourself in a hushed church, the stained glass windows casting colourful patterns on the polished pews. The sermon speaks not just of earthly existence, but of a heavenly realm, a place where loved ones, snatched away too soon by disease, were waiting. This profound faith offered comfort, solace, and a structured framework for understanding and processing loss. You see, Christianity, particularly various denominations of Protestantism, permeated Victorian society. The Bible was a cornerstone of education and moral guidance, and its teachings on death, resurrection, and eternal life provided a powerful balm for grieving hearts. Death was not seen as an absolute end, but as a transition, a journey to a better place where souls would be reunited. This belief system encouraged acceptance of mortality, viewing it as God's will rather than an arbitrary or cruel fate. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive influence of Christian eschatology, beliefs about the end times and afterlife, profoundly shaped Victorian attitudes towards death and mourning. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on the afterlife reflected a genuine spiritual conviction, or if it was also a societal coping mechanism for the overwhelming grief caused by high mortality rates. It's a bit like trying to find the silver lining in a relentless rainstorm. Sometimes you simply need to believe the sun will shine again. You might find yourself clinging to the promise of reunion, visualizing a heaven where children who died in infancy were now angels waiting for their parents. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Victorian religious tracts depicted heaven in surprisingly literal, almost earthly terms as a place of endless reunion and domestic bliss, a perfect version of the ideal Victorian home. Imagine a heavenly manor house, eternally well-stocked with tea and conversation, where your lost loved ones awaited you. The quiet ritual of Sunday services, the solemn hymns, and the heartfelt prayers provided a communal space for processing grief and reinforcing the hope of eternal life. This deep spiritual foundation provided not just a sense of comfort, but also dictated many of the elaborate rituals surrounding death, transforming it from a mere biological event into a profound spiritual passage. While religious belief provided a universal framework for coping with death, a singular, powerful event deeply shaped Victorian mourning practices and amplified the era's fascination with the departed, Queen Victoria's enduring grief. Imagine the entire nation plunged into a profound, almost ritualistic sorrow. From the moment Prince Albert, her beloved husband, died in 1861, Victoria retreated into a state of perpetual mourning, a personal sorrow that became a national template for grief. You see, for the rest of her exceptionally long reign, nearly 4 decades, Queen Victoria wore black, abstained from many public functions, and kept Albert's memory alive in countless ways, from maintaining his rooms as if he were still alive to commissioning numerous memorials. Her private grief became a public spectacle, a powerful example of devotion and loss that trickled down through all strata of society. This mainstream historical fact, Queen Victoria's lifelong mourning for Prince Albert, profoundly influenced and solidified the elaborate mourning rituals that became synonymous with the Victorian era. It set a precedent for how deep, prolonged, and visible grief was expected to be. Historians still argue whether the Queen's profound and unwavering mourning was a genuine expression of an unusually deep bond, or if it was also a strategic performance of widowhood that reinforced her moral authority and resonated with a nation experiencing constant loss. It's a complex blend, isn't it? Because while her love for Albert was undeniable, her public grief also served a powerful social function, providing a relatable figurehead for a death-obsessed nation. You might, as a common citizen, feel a strange sense of kinship with your distant monarch, witnessing her unwavering sorrow and perhaps finding validation for your own private grief. Here's a quirky tidbit. Queen Victoria even had special mourning, stationery made with black borders that grew narrower over time, signaling the gradual progression through the stages of grief. Imagine the meticulous attention to detail, even in stationery, reflecting the rigid adherence to mourning etiquette. The quiet, almost theatrical omnipresence of mourning, from the highest echelons of society down to the humblest cottage, meant that death was not just experienced but performed, publicly and privately, day after day, year after year. The Queen's grief, therefore, wasn't just her own, it was the nation's grief, amplified and ritualized, further embedding death into the very fabric of Victorian life. Building on the powerful examples set by the monarch, Victorian society developed incredibly intricate and exacting standards for expressing grief. This brings us to the fascinating, sometimes bewildering, world of elaborate mourning rituals. Imagine yourself having just lost a loved one. The immediate aftermath isn't just about personal sorrow. It's about navigating a labyrinth of strict rules and expectations governing every aspect of your appearance and behavior, all designed to visibly communicate your grief to the world. You see, mourning wasn't a private affair. It was a highly public performance dictated by a rigid code of etiquette. The specific mourning attire, the type of fabric, the depth of black, the absence of ornamentation, changed depending on your relationship to the deceased and the duration of your mourning. Period. For a widow, deep mourning could last for 2 years, requiring dull crepe fabric that absorbed light, signifying profound sorrow. Even the length of your veil, the type of jewelry you could wear, jet specifically, was acceptable. And the kind of social engagements you could attend were strictly prescribed. This mainstream historical fact, the highly codified and elaborate nature of Victorian mourning rituals, was a defining characteristic of the era's relationship with death. Historians still argue whether the strict adherence to these mourning codes was primarily a genuine expression of grief and respect for the dead, or if it also served as a means of social display, demonstrating one's wealth, status, and adherence to proper etiquette. It's a bit like wondering if wearing a designer suit is purely for warmth, or if it also signals your place in society. You might find yourself meticulously following these rules, even if they felt burdensome, knowing that any deviation would be seen as disrespectful to the deceased and a stain on your family's reputation. Here's a quirky tidbit. There were even specific rules for children's mourning attire, typically white for very young children who died, and progressively darker shades as they aged, reflecting a grim arithmetic of loss. Imagine having entire wardrobes dedicated solely to mourning, with different stages of black for different periods of grief. The quiet, pervasive presence of these rituals meant that death wasn't something that faded quickly from view. Instead, it was actively prolonged and commemorated through daily visible cues, keeping the departed and the reality of mortality firmly in the forefront of public consciousness. These rituals, while seemingly oppressive, also offered a structured way for a society constantly touched by death to process its immense sorrow. In an era where the deceased were often prepared for viewing at home and mourning rituals were meticulously observed, a new, poignant practice emerged that cemented death's presence in the family album. Post-mortem photography's rise. Imagine you, a Victorian parent, facing the unbearable loss of a child. Before the embalmer's art became widespread, and with no instant cameras to capture fleeting moments, this unique form of photography offered one last, precious opportunity to immortalize your beloved. You see, for many Victorian families, a post-mortem photograph was the only image they would ever possess of their departed loved one, especially if the deceased was an infant or young child who might not have lived long enough for a portrait sitting. Photographers would be summoned to the home, where they would carefully pose the deceased, often made to look as if they were merely sleeping, sometimes even placed with family members to create a poignant tableau. These images, while unsettling, to modern sensibilities, were not macabre attempts to sensationalize death, but deeply personal mementos, expressions of enduring love and grief. This mainstream historical fact, the widespread practice of post-mortem photography, highlights the Victorian obsession with remembrance and the desperate need to hold on to a tangible representation of the lost. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these photographs was a profound psychological need to process grief, or if it was also a reflection of the economic reality that such a photograph might be the only enduring image a family ever had of a deceased member. It's a bit like buying a cherished piece of jewelry. It holds emotional value, but it's also a tangible asset. You might gaze at such a photograph for years, finding comfort in the stillness of the captured image, a permanent echo of a fleeting life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some post-mortem photographs show the deceased with open eyes, achieved by propping the eyelids open, or even having family members discreetly hold them in place. Imagine the eerie, almost lifelike quality this would lend to an otherwise somber image, further blurring the line between slumber and eternal rest. The quiet ritual of posing for these photographs, the profound desire to preserve a visual memory, underscores the depth of Victorian grief and their unique ways of coping with the pervasive presence of death. These photographs, passed down through generations, became powerful mementos, tangible links to the departed, embedding death firmly within the family's visual history. With the physical presence of the deceased preserved in photographs, many Victorians extended their desire for connection beyond the grave, venturing into the enigmatic realm of spirituality and seances. Imagine yourself in a darkened parlor, the air heavy with anticipation, perhaps a single candle flickering on a small table. You are holding hands with others, your heart thrumming, hoping for a sign, a whisper, a tangible connection to a loved one who has passed beyond the veil. You see, the immense grief and constant loss experienced by Victorians fueled a burgeoning interest in spiritualism, a movement that gained widespread popularity in the latter half of the 19th century. Seances, where mediums claimed to communicate with the spirits of the dead, became a common, albeit often controversial, practice. From table rapping and disembodied voices to full materializations, people desperately sought tangible proof that their loved ones were not truly gone. This mainstream historical fact, the widespread fascination with spiritualism and seances, highlights the Victorian era's profound need to find comfort and connection in the face of overwhelming mortality. Historians still argue whether the popularity of spiritualism was a genuine spiritual awakening, or if it was primarily a psychological coping mechanism for grief that provided a sense of control in an unpredictable world. It's a bit like trying to find a comforting hand in the dark when you're truly afraid. Sometimes the illusion of connection is enough. You might find yourself drawn to these gatherings, clutching a lock of hair from a deceased child, hoping, against hope for a sign, a whisper, anything to ease the gnawing ache of loss. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some famous mediums of the era were renowned for their elaborate tricks, employing hidden wires, false beards, and even secret trapdoors to create convincing apparitions and auditory phenomena. Imagine paying good money to speak to your deceased aunt, only for her voice to be produced by a hidden trumpet. The quiet desperation to believe, however, often overshadowed any rational skepticism. The quiet solemnity of these gatherings, the blend of profound hope and genuine credulity, underscores how deeply entrenched the departed were in the Victorian psyche. The desire to reach across the divide, to maintain a connection with the dead, was a powerful force, embedding death, not just in memory but in active, if often illusory, communication. While spiritualism offered a fleeting connection, the Victorians also sought more permanent ways to honor their deceased, transforming public spaces into tangible realms of remembrance. This leads us to the evolution of cemetery and tombstone art. Imagine strolling through a vast landscaped garden, not of vibrant flowers, but of intricately carved stone, towering obelisks and weeping angels. These weren't just burial grounds, they were meticulously designed cities of the dead, meant for public contemplation and enduring commemoration. You see, with churchyards becoming overcrowded and unsanitary, the Victorian era saw the rise of large, picturesque garden cemeteries on the outskirts of cities. These new spaces, like London's Highgate Cemetery or Paris's Père Lachaise, were designed not just for interment, but as places for families to visit, picnic, and reflect. The tombstones themselves evolved from simple slabs into elaborate monuments, adorned with symbolic carvings that spoke volumes about the deceased's life, virtues, and the family's grief. This mainstream historical fact, the development of grand, landscaped cemeteries and highly symbolic tombstone art, reflects a profound shift in how Victorians publicly engaged with death and remembrance. Historians still argue whether the aesthetic, beauty and grandiosity of these cemeteries were primarily a genuine expression of profound grief, or if they also served as a display of social status and wealth among the burgeoning middle and upper classes. It's a bit like wondering if a fancy wedding cake is mostly about taste or mostly about showing off. You might spend an afternoon wandering through these serene landscapes, deciphering the symbolism on the gravestones. A broken column signifying a life cut short, a draped urn representing the finality of death, or an ivy vine denoting eternal life. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some wealthier families even commissioned miniature replicas of their own homes or elaborate Gothic cathedrals as mausoleums, creating private, permanent residences for their deceased loved ones. Imagine a tiny, eternal mansion for your departed aunt. The quiet reverence that permeated these spaces, the blend of public grief and private solace, meant that death was not just commemorated but integrated into the urban landscape as a place of beauty and contemplation. The art and architecture of the grave became a lasting testament to a society deeply, complexly obsessed with its dead. Beyond the grand monuments and public spaces, the Victorian obsession with death permeated the most intimate corners of daily life, manifesting in the widespread use of memento mori, objects of remembrance. Imagine reaching into your pocket or glancing at your mantelpiece and encountering a small, seemingly ordinary item that upon closer inspection reveals a poignant, often chilling, connection to the deceased. These weren't just sentimental trinkets. They were tangible reminders of mortality and loved ones lost, woven into the very fabric of everyday existence. You see, with death a constant presence, Victorians developed a rich culture of memorialization through personal objects. This could include lockets containing snippets of the deceased's hair, carefully braided and worn as jewelry. Mourning rings, often made of black enamel or jet, would bear the name and dates of the departed. Tiny miniature portraits of deceased children, sometimes painted on ivory, would be carried close to the heart. Even common household items like tea sets or sewing boxes could be adorned with subtle mourning motifs, ensuring that remembrance was never far from sight. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive creation and use of memento mori, demonstrates the Victorian era's deep psychological need to keep the memory of the dead tangible and integrated into daily life. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these personal mementos was a sign of genuine, healthy grieving, or if it sometimes bordered on an unhealthy fixation that prolonged sorrow. It's a bit like wondering if constantly looking at old photographs helps you move on or keeps you stuck in the past. You might absent-mindedly finger a ring on your hand, feeling the smooth, cold jet, and remembering the person it represents. a constant, quiet presence in your day. Here's a quirky tidbit. One of the more unusual forms of hair jewelry involved intricate hair flowers or hair pictures, where entire scenes or bouquets were meticulously crafted from the deceased's hair, often encased under glass. Imagine a beautiful, delicate work of art made entirely from human hair. The quiet dedication involved in creating such intimate, sometimes macabre keepsakes underscores the profound desire to physically hold on to a piece of the departed. These everyday objects, laden with symbolic weight, ensured that death was not just a somber event, but a constant, gentle, yet ever-present whisper in the fabric of Victorian daily life. Beyond personal mementos and solemn cemeteries, the Victorian obsession with death also found a more sensational and public outlet, blurring the lines between morbid fascination and moral lesson. This brings us to the grisly spectacle of sensational crime and public executions. Imagine crowds gathering, eager to read the latest broadside detailing a brutal murder, or worse, pressing in to witness a public hanging. Death in these instances became a morbid form of entertainment and a stark reminder of societal consequences. You see, the Victorian era witnessed a surge in public interest in crime, fueled by a rapidly expanding print media. Newspapers and penny dreadfuls capitalized on sensational murders, often providing graphic details and speculative theories. The public devoured these stories not just for their shock value, but often for the moral lessons they supposedly conveyed about good versus evil and the inevitable downfall of vice. Public executions, though diminishing towards the end of the century, the last public hanging in Britain was in 1868, were once major events drawing huge crowds. These spectacles served as powerful deterrents and reaffirmations of justice. This mainstream historical fact, the era's intense public fascination with sensational crime and capital punishment, underscores how death permeated not just private grief, but also public discourse and entertainment. Historians still argue whether the public's appetite for sensational crime was primarily a reflection of genuine social anxieties about rising crime rates, or if it was also a form of escapism and vicarious thrill-seeking in a rigid society. It's a bit like watching a horror movie. You're terrified, but also strangely compelled. You might find yourself discussing the latest gruesome murder with your neighbors, or reading aloud from a newspaper account of a particularly shocking crime, a blend of morbid curiosity and moral righteousness. Here's a quirky tidbit. Vendors at public executions would sell souvenirs, including pamphlets detailing the condemned's last words, and even scraps of the hanging rope, believed to bring good luck. Imagine selling a piece of the gallows. The quiet hum of conversation, the rustle of newspapers, and the shared morbid fascination created a communal experience around death that was far removed from the private rituals of mourning. This darker, more public engagement with death, however disturbing to modern sensibilities, was another undeniable facet of the Victorian era's profound and multi-layered obsession with mortality. The Victorian obsession with death wasn't confined to morbid news stories or private keepsakes. It permeated the very narratives they consumed for pleasure. This leads us to literature's macabre fascination. Imagine curling up by the fire with a novel, a collection of poetry, or a gripping serialized story. From the opening chapters, you might encounter lingering deaths, ghostly apparitions, desolate graveyards, or profound expressions of grief that would feel remarkably intense to a modern reader. You see, Victorian literature in all its forms was saturated with themes of death, loss, and the supernatural. Poets like Alfred Lord Tennyson grappled with profound grief in works like In Memoriam A.H.H. after the death of his friend. Charles Dickens often featured death scenes that were both sentimental and starkly realistic. Gothic novels, with their haunted houses, decaying mansions, and tormented spirits were immensely popular, allowing readers to explore the darker side of mortality from a safe distance. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive presence of death as a central theme in Victorian literature, reflects how deeply ingrained the concept was in the era's cultural consciousness. Historians still argue whether literature merely mirrored society's existing preoccupation with death, or if it actively contributed to and shaped it, offering new ways to contemplate mortality and the afterlife. It's a bit like wondering if a mirror simply shows you what's there, or if it subtly influences how you see yourself. You might find yourself shedding tears over the death of a fictional character, finding catharsis in shared sorrow, or perhaps thrilling to the chills of a ghost story set in a haunted old manor. Here's a quirky tidbit. The popularity of ghost stories, especially during the Christmas season, reached its peak in the Victorian era. Families would gather around the fire to tell tales of spectres and phantoms, turning moments of festive cheer into opportunities for polite terror. Imagine swapping cheerful carols for a chilling tale of a spectral visitor. The quiet power of these narratives, the way they allowed Victorians to explore their deepest fears and hopes about death, meant that the departed and the transition to the afterlife were not just subjects of theological debate, but thrilling, compelling, and often comforting works of art. The printed page, therefore, became another vital space where the Victorian obsession with death was continually explored and expressed. While literature and popular entertainment explored the psychological and cultural dimensions of death, the physical reality of it was often driven by a chilling lack of knowledge. This leads us to medical ignorance and disease. Imagine you, a Victorian person, falling ill with a fever, a persistent cough, or a sudden, mysterious ailment. You would enter a medical landscape where the causes of most diseases were unknown, treatments were often ineffective, and diagnoses were frequently little more than educated guesses. You see, the Victorian era preceded the widespread understanding of germ theory. Doctors often believed diseases were caused by miasmas, bad air, imbalances in the body's humours, or moral failings. This meant that practices like hand-washing, sanitation, and sterile surgery were not widely adopted, inadvertently contributing to the spread of illness. Epidemics of cholera, smallpox, and tuberculosis swept through communities with devastating regularity, claiming lives with terrifying speed and impunity. This mainstream historical fact, the primitive state of Victorian medicine and the rampant spread of infectious diseases, was a primary reason why death was such a constant and unpredictable force in daily life. Historians still argue whether the slow adoption of germ theory was due to resistance from established medical authorities, or simply the immense challenge of overturning centuries of entrenched medical beliefs. It's a bit like trying to convince a cart and horse driver that a noisy, complicated automobile is actually a better way to travel. The old ways feel more familiar and reliable. You might find yourself dreading the sniffle that turned into a hacking cough, or the stomachache that quickly escalated into something far more serious, knowing that a doctor's visit offered little guarantee of recovery. Here's a quirky tidbit. Consumption, tuberculosis, was often romanticized in art and literature, with its victims depicted as pale, ethereal, and tragically beautiful despite the horrific reality of the slow, painful, wasting disease. Imagine a beautiful, delicate character slowly dying in a novel, while in real life, victims coughed up blood and withered away, a stark contrast to the romanticized image. The quiet fear that lingered in every home, the knowledge that a loved one could be snatched away at any moment by an unseen enemy, meant that death was not just a theoretical concept, but a deeply personal, ever-present threat. This lack of medical Understanding ensured that death remained a powerful, unpredictable force, embedding itself deeply in the Victorian consciousness. Despite the grim realities of disease and poor medicine, Victorians found ways to integrate death into the very fabric of their urban landscapes, transforming places of sorrow into spaces of repose and even recreation. This brings us to the fascinating phenomenon of cemeteries as public parks. Imagine yourself seeking respite from the bustling, often grimy, city streets. You might choose to spend a leisurely afternoon in a grand, beautifully landscaped garden filled with winding paths, exotic trees and tranquil ponds. But this isn't just any park. It's a vast necropolis teeming with the silent residents of the past. You see, as traditional churchyards became overcrowded and unsanitary within burgeoning cities, the mid-19th century saw the development of large, suburban garden cemeteries. These weren't merely functional burial grounds. They were meticulously designed, often by renowned landscape architects, with grand avenues, picturesque vistas, and impressive monuments. They offered a much-needed green space for city dwellers, serving as popular destinations for strolls, picnics, and quiet contemplation. Families would visit their departed loved ones, often spending hours by the graveside, making these spaces part of their regular social routine. This mainstream historical fact, the dual purpose of Victorian cemeteries as both burial grounds and public recreational areas, highlights the era's unique integration of death into daily life. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these rural cemeteries was primarily driven by sanitary concerns and overcrowding, or by a romanticized ideal of death as a beautiful, natural transition that deserved an equally beautiful setting. It's a bit like deciding if you're buying a new sofa purely for comfort, or if its aesthetic appeal plays a larger role. You might bring a book, a sketch pad, or simply sit on a bench observing others, reflecting on life and mortality in a setting of cultivated beauty. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some guidebooks were even published for these cemeteries, detailing notable burials, architectural features, and optimal routes for a pleasant walk, turning them into tourist attractions of a sort. Imagine a guide suggesting the best tombstone to admire or the most picturesque weeping willow to sit under. The quiet blend of sorrow and serenity in these spaces meant that death was not banished to the periphery, but celebrated, visited, and normalized as an integral part of the human experience. These vast, beautiful cemeteries became open-air museums of mortality, embedding the presence of the dead deeply into the Victorian urban landscape and psyche. As public engagement with death deepened, so too did the infrastructure surrounding it, transforming a solemn necessity into a burgeoning industry. This leads us to undertaking's commercialization. Imagine a society where the final rites for your loved one were no longer solely a family affair or a somber church duty, but a meticulously organized service provided by increasingly professionalized businesses. The business of death expanded rapidly, driven by demand and a desire for decorum. You see, before the Victorian era, funerals were often simpler, managed by the family and local community. But as populations grew, and as concepts of sanitation and proper mourning evolved, the role of the undertaker became more formalized and elaborate. They offered everything from coffin selection and transportation to arranging flowers, mourning, attire, and even providing hearse plumes. The emphasis shifted from a humble burial to a dignified funeral, a public spectacle that reflected the deceased's and the family's status. This mainstream historical fact, the rise of professional undertaking, and the commercialization of funeral services underscores how every aspect of death became integrated into Victorian society and economy. Historians still argue whether the increased commercialization of death made the grieving process easier by handling practicalities, or if it sometimes exploited families' grief by encouraging extravagant and unnecessary expenses. It's a bit like deciding if a fancy wedding planner is a blessing or a financial burden. It depends on your budget and priorities. You might find yourself consulting with an undertaker, choosing between different grades of coffins, considering the number of horses for the hearse, all while grappling with your personal sorrow. Here's a quirky tidbit. To ensure the deceased looked presentable for viewing, especially given the lack of modern embalming, undertakers would often use elaborate techniques like laying out the body on cooling boards filled with ice, or even employing rudimentary cosmetic methods to restore a lifelike appearance. Imagine an undertaker using special powders and waxes to make your departed aunt look as if she were merely sleeping. The quiet efficiency of these new professionals who took on the grim but necessary tasks meant that death, for all its emotional weight, also became a highly organized, often elaborate, and increasingly costly affair. The commercial aspects of death further cemented its presence as an unavoidable, economically significant part of Victorian life. The Victorian era's profound relationship with death wasn't just evident in social customs or commercial practices, it permeated their very aesthetic, shaping the visual world around them. This leads us to Gothic architecture and aesthetics. Imagine standing before a grand public building, a church, or even a domestic dwelling. You'd likely observe an embrace of intricate details, dark hues, pointed arches, and a general air of solemnity that spoke volumes about the era's fascination with mortality and the sublime. You see, the Gothic revival movement, which gained immense popularity throughout the Victorian era, wasn't just an architectural style. It was a cultural phenomenon that looked back to the medieval period, an era often associated with death, chivalry, and intense religious devotion. This manifested in buildings with soaring spires, intricate carvings of gargoyles, and grotesque figures, and interiors that often felt somber and contemplative. Even furniture and decorative arts adopted darker woods, heavier fabrics, and motifs like funerary urns, weeping willows, or shrouded figures. This mainstream historical fact, the pervasive influence of Gothic aesthetics in Victorian art and architecture, reflects a society that found beauty and meaning in the serious and the macabre. Historians still argue whether the popularity of Gothic revival was primarily a nostalgic longing for a romanticized past, a rejection of industrial modernity, or a genuine spiritual yearning for the transcendent in an age of scientific advancement. It's a bit like choosing a darkly elegant outfit. It might be because you appreciate the style, or because it reflects a deeper mood. You might walk into a newly built church and feel a sense of awe mixed with solemnity, the towering columns, and dim light drawing your thoughts towards the eternal. Here's a quirky tidbit. Even small, everyday objects like jewelry or stationery often incorporated tiny skulls, coffins, or hourglasses as subtle reminders of mortality, blending the macabre with the mundane. Imagine receiving a polite letter adorned with a tiny, stylized skeleton. The quiet reverence for the past, the fascination with the solemn and the sublime meant that death was not just an event to be mourned, but an aesthetic to be appreciated, integrated into the very visual language of the era. The prevalence of Gothic architecture and design therefore serves as a lasting, tangible testament to the Victorian age's deep, complex, and undeniable obsession with death. As our journey through the Victorian obsession with death draws to a close, we are left with a rich tapestry of social customs, artistic expressions, and profound human responses to mortality. This brings us to the enduring legacy of death culture, a complex inheritance that continues to shape our modern perspectives, even if unconsciously. Imagine looking at our contemporary world where death is often hidden away, sanitized, and rarely discussed openly. The Victorian era offers a stark contrast, revealing a time when death was not just an event, but a constant, intimate presence. deeply integrated into daily life. You see, many of the funeral customs we still observe today, from wearing black to sending sympathy cards, have direct roots in Victorian mourning rituals. The concept of the wake, the dignified procession, and the importance of a lasting memorial all owe something to the Victorian era's meticulous approach to death. While we no longer pose with our deceased relatives for photographs or spend years in full mourning attire, the underlying impulse to honor the dead and provide comfort to the living remains. This mainstream historical fact, the lasting influence of Victorian mourning practices on modern funeral customs, demonstrates how profoundly their engagement with death shaped the subsequent centuries. Historians still argue whether the Victorian era's intense focus on death ultimately led to a healthier societal acceptance of mortality, or if its excesses eventually provoked a modern recoil into denial and concealment. It's a bit like wondering if a massive feast, while satisfying at the time, eventually leads to a cultural preference for lighter meals. You might consider how the Victorian willingness to confront death head-on, to integrate it into art, literature, and daily conversation, offers a poignant contrast to our often uncomfortable silence around the topic today. Here's a quirky tidbit to carry with you as we drift off. Even our modern phrase, "rest in peace," has strong roots in Victorian cemetery. Inscriptions which often included lengthy epitaphs and religious verses expressing hope for eternal repose. Imagine a simple phrase used countless times, carrying the weight of centuries of mourning and spiritual belief. The quiet understanding we now possess about the Victorian obsession with death allows us to see their world not as morbid or strange, but as a deeply human response to the unavoidable realities of life and loss. Their profound engagement with death, however elaborate or peculiar it may seem to us, served as a crucial coping mechanism, a way for an entire society to navigate pervasive grief and the ever-present shadow of mortality. Their quiet rituals, their public displays of sorrow, and their artistic expressions of loss all combined to create a culture where death was not denied, but acknowledged, revered, and, in its own way, celebrated as an integral part of the human journey. As the gaslights dim and the hum of the city outside fades, you can almost hear the hushed conversations, the rustle of black crepe, and the quiet comfort of a shared grief in a world that never shied away from its ultimate truth. Let the anxieties of a bygone era, the solemn beauty of its customs, gently recede now. The history, the knowledge, the quiet reverence for life's inevitable end now drifts away on the soft currents of your breath. Allow yourself to loosen your grip on the day's thoughts, letting them soften and blur. The whispers of the past are becoming fainter, merging with the calm, steady rhythm of your own heart. All the complexities, all the worries, all the curious details, they are simply sounds now, fading into the comfortable quiet. Just listen to the soft hush, feel the peaceful stillness surrounding you, and let your mind unwind. Sweet dreams.